I stood alone at my father-in-law's hospital bedside. Empty rooms echoed with supportive families. Mine stayed silent. No husband, no friends, no calls. Not even my brother. When the doctor marked the time of death, I whispered his final letter. Inside were names, a key, and one chilling instruction. I, 34F, stood alone in that sterile hospital room, watching the monitors flatline as my father-in-law took his final breath. The silence was deafening, not just from the machines, but from the complete absence of anyone who should have been there with me. No husband rushing through the doors. No concerned calls from friends. Not even my brother, who I'd texted hours ago about the situation deteriorating. The doctor entered and marked the time of death with clinical precision. After he left, I sat there staring at the man who had been more of a father to me than my own ever was. That's when I remembered the letter he'd pressed into my hands 3 days earlier, when he was still lucid enough to speak in whispers. I pulled the envelope from my purse with trembling fingers. My name was written across it in his shaky handwriting, along with the words, "When I'm gone." Inside, I found a handwritten note, a small brass key, and a list of names that made my blood run cold. The letter explained everything. How my husband had been systematically poisoning his father's mind against me for months, telling him I was only after his money. How my brother had been feeding information to my husband about my conversations with our father-in-law, creating a web of lies that isolated me from the one person who truly cared. How my so-called friends had been recruited into this campaign of emotional warfare, convinced that I was manipulative and untrustworthy. But my father-in-law had seen through it all. The key, he wrote, opened a safety deposit box at First National Bank. Inside, I would find documents that would change everything. I drove to the bank the next morning, my hands still shaking from grief and rage. The safety deposit box contained copies of my husband's text messages to my brother, detailing their plan to isolate me completely. Screenshots of group chats with my friends, where they discussed how to gradually distance themselves from me. Bank statements showing my husband had been stealing from his father's accounts for over a year. And most damning of all, a recording device with hours of conversations between my husband and brother, plotting to have me committed to a psychiatric facility once his father died. They thought I would break. They thought I would crumble under the weight of complete isolation. They were wrong. I spent the next week in careful preparation. I made copies of everything, stored them in multiple locations, and began documenting every interaction I had with each person on that list. My father-in-law's final instruction was simple but devastating: make them face the truth of what they've done. The funeral was a masterclass in hypocrisy. My husband played the grieving son perfectly, accepting condolences while barely acknowledging my presence. My brother stood beside him, offering support to the real family. My former friends whispered among themselves, shooting me pitying looks as if I were the problem. I waited until everyone had gathered at my in-laws' house for the reception. That's when I made my move. I stood up in the living room and announced I had something to share from my father-in-law's final wishes. Everyone fell silent, expecting some touching tribute or reading of the will. Instead, I began playing the recordings from my phone, connected to the house's sound system. The first recording was my husband's voice, crystal clear, explaining to my brother how they needed to make me seem unstable. How isolating me from his father would make it easier to contest any inheritance I might receive. The room went dead silent as his words filled the space. The second recording was even worse. My brother's voice detailing how he'd been reporting back every conversation I'd had with him about feeling lonely and confused. How they'd used my vulnerability against me, twisting my words to paint me as paranoid and manipulative. But the third recording broke the dam completely. My husband and brother discussing the psychiatric facility plan, laughing about how easy it would be to have me committed once I was completely isolated and his father was gone. They talked about selling the house, splitting the inheritance, and starting fresh without the dead weight of dealing with me. The silence that followed was deafening. My husband's face had gone completely white. My brother looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. My former friends stared in horror, finally understanding how they'd been manipulated into abandoning someone who had never wronged them. I let the silence stretch before speaking again. I told them about the bank statements, the documented theft, the systematic campaign of emotional abuse. I explained how my father-in-law had seen through their lies and spent his final months gathering evidence of their betrayal. My husband tried to stammer out some explanation, but I cut him off. I told him I'd already filed for divorce and reported the financial theft to the authorities. I informed my brother that I was pressing charges for harassment and conspiracy. I looked at my former friends and told them they were welcome to examine their consciences and decide whether they could live with what they'd participated in. Then I walked out, leaving them all to face the wreckage of their carefully constructed lies. Update 1. The aftermath was swift and brutal. My husband was arrested 2 days later on embezzlement charges. The evidence my father-in-law had gathered was overwhelming, not just the bank statements, but security footage from the bank, forged signatures, and a paper trail that went back over a year. My brother tried to claim he was just following my husband's lead, but the recordings made it clear he was an active participant in the psychological warfare. He lost his job when his employer learned about the charges, and his wife filed for separation after hearing the recordings. The most satisfying part was watching my former friends scramble to distance themselves from the situation. They started calling, sending texts, trying to explain how they'd been deceived. But I'd learned something valuable from this experience. Actions reveal character, and their actions had shown me exactly who they were when it mattered most. 3 of them showed up at my apartment together, wanting to apologize in person. They explained how my husband had been feeding them stories about my behavior, making them believe I was becoming unstable and potentially dangerous. They claimed they thought they were protecting themselves and others by gradually pulling away. I listened to their explanations without interrupting. When they finished, I asked them a simple question. When had I ever given them reason to believe I was unstable or dangerous? They couldn't answer because the truth was, I never had. They'd chosen to believe lies about someone they'd known for years rather than trust their own experiences with me. I told them I appreciated their apology, but that our friendships were over. Trust, once broken this completely, couldn't be repaired with explanations and regret. Update 2. My father-in-law's will reading was scheduled for 2 weeks after the funeral. I attended alone, which no longer felt isolating but empowering. The lawyer read through the standard bequests, small amounts to various charities, personal items to family members. Then he reached the section that made my husband's face go ashen. My father-in-law had left me the house, his investment portfolio, and a substantial cash inheritance. But more importantly, he'd included a letter to be read aloud that detailed exactly why he'd made these decisions. He explained how he'd discovered the theft, the manipulation, and the campaign to isolate me. He stated clearly that he considered me his true daughter and that my husband had forfeited any claim to his love or his legacy through his actions. My husband tried to contest the will, claiming his father had been mentally incompetent. But my father-in-law had anticipated this too. He'd undergone a complete psychological evaluation just weeks before his death, specifically to prevent any challenges to his mental capacity. The evaluation was included with the will documents, showing him to be completely sound of mind. The inheritance wasn't just about money, it was vindication. It was proof that someone had seen through the lies and manipulation, someone had recognized my worth when everyone else had been convinced to abandon me. Update 3. 6 months later, I was settling into my new life in the house my father-in-law had left me. My husband had been sentenced to 3 years in prison for embezzlement and fraud. My brother was facing his own legal battles and had lost everything: his job, his marriage, his reputation in our small community. The most unexpected development came from an unlikely source. My mother-in-law, who had initially been devastated by the revelations about her son, reached out to me. She'd found her own evidence of his lies, credit card statements showing expensive dinners and hotel rooms that coincided with times he'd claimed to be working late or caring for his father. She apologized for not seeing what was happening, for not protecting me from her son's manipulation. She asked if we could maintain some kind of relationship, since I was the only connection she had left to the man her husband had been proud to call his daughter. I agreed, but on my terms. No more family obligations, no more pretending everything was normal. Just two women who had both been betrayed by someone they'd trusted, finding a way to move forward with honesty. The house felt different now, not like a prize I'd won, but like a sanctuary I'd earned. I'd learned that being alone wasn't the same as being abandoned, and that sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones most willing to destroy you for their own gain. My father-in-law's final gift wasn't just the inheritance, it was the truth. And sometimes, the truth is the most powerful weapon you can wield against those who've wronged you. They tried to break me by taking away everyone I thought I could count on. Instead, they'd shown me exactly who I could count on, myself. I kept my father-in-law's letter on my desk as a reminder. Not of the betrayal, but of the fact that someone had seen my worth when I'd forgotten it myself. Someone had fought for me even when I didn't know I needed fighting for. And in the end, that was enough to build a new life on, one where I would never again mistake manipulation for love, or isolation for abandonment. The silence in my house now was peaceful, not empty. It was the sound of a life reclaimed, a truth revealed, and a future that belonged entirely to me.